James Marshall is known for helping to find and discover gold in January of 1848, but there is a lot more to his life, and we're going to look at how he got to this part of life with his tradesman and labor skills, and also talk about the challenges that James Marshall faced with money, with his health, and how he was able to face those challenges, and then look at how do you deal with your successes and your challenges in your life. So thanks for joining. James Marshall was born in 1810 in Lambertville, New Jersey. He trained with his father to become a wagon builder. He was many things under a wagon builder. He learned how to work with metal as a blacksmith. He learned how to work with wood as a carpenter. And he could do very fine detailed work like making a perfect circle out of wood. In other words, he was a wheelwright. And he spent his first 24 years in New Jersey. He had 3 younger sisters. He was the eldest, and when his dad passed away, he traveled west, and he was able to work as a carpenter and a craftsman through Indiana, through Illinois, and eventually made his way out to Missouri, and he was a farmer in Missouri for a while. He met a woman and tried to get a relationship going, but that did not go well, and Mr. James Marshall also ended up getting malaria, which they called ague in the day. And so James Marshall had to move west to leave behind his land, leave behind his lost love, and leave behind his bad health and hopefully move on to better things. So James Marshall reached California in summer of 1845, and he worked for Mr. Sutter, and he built many things for the other tradespeople in Sutter's fort. He would build anything out of metal or out of wood because he had all those skills. And then after using all of those skills to get quite a lot of credit with Mr. Sutter, James Marshall moved up north in California and became a rancher on his own land in 1846. But that did not last real long because he became a soldier in the Bear Flag Rebellion and eventually joined Mr. Fremont's battalion in the Mexican-American War. In the Mexican-American War, James was twice commended for using his carpentry and metallurgy skills to quickly think of ways to help out when the battalion was under pressure. But James Marshall was not super happy because at the end of his Mexican-American War service, he returned to his ranch and all of his livestock had been stolen, his grain was gone, and other people were living on his land. And at that time in California, there were no people to go to resolve this issue. There wasn't much of a court system. There weren't sheriffs around much because we were in the middle of a war. And so James Marshall had to go back to John Sutter for one more project. And so he had his skills, and his morals meant that he stood up for other people in his community and his battalion. But he still was not getting a whole lot of luck in life. So for Mr. Sutter, James Marshall led a crew of 6 to 8 people up to Coloma, and he worked to build a sawmill where they could cut down trees and cut those trees into boards. And once the boards were done, they could be trekked back to Sutter's fort, where they would be used to build a grist mill to grind wheat into flour, and the wood could also be used for other buildings besides that grist mill. The workers that were with him were members of the Mormon Battalion, along with the Wimmer family. But that is not why James Marshall is famous in Coloma, because James Marshall discovered gold on January 24th, 1848. He was 37 years old, and he learned that unfortunately dreams do not always come true. During the gold rush, 1848 to 1850, James Marshall worked selling wood from the sawmill. He tried gold mining, he tried farming, he did a lot, but he was forced out of Coloma because at one time he stood up for the Native Americans that were working with him when a bunch of a mob of drunk people came up and thought that his work crew were a crew of Indians that they believed had murdered some of their mates. And so James Marshall said, nope, these people have been working with me. If you want to look for murderers, look elsewhere. But the mob did not listen to him, and they said, "We don't like you, we don't like them, and if you're going to stand with them, you're going to die with them." And James Marshall had to get out. He was nearly killed, and 8 of his crew did get killed by those drunken men. Because he'd stood up for the rights of them, he was not welcome in the town, and so he had to leave, and he had to find some other way of getting jobs in the turbulent times. He did not get rich from the gold rush because he didn't own the land. He was good at crafts, but he was not good at business. And so he had strong morals. He stood up for the rights of others. But when others disagreed with him, he was not welcome. He stood up for the rights when the local Chinese were pressured. He stood up for the rights of others when the Irish were pressured, because that was an issue in the gold rush times. But he tried getting by outside of Coloma. He went mining and ranching and milling and various other jobs throughout California for quite a few years, but had very little success. And finally, he returned in 1857 to Coloma, because when he had been elsewhere, everybody said, "You're the guy that discovered gold. You can show us where gold is, right?" He was not very good at showing them where gold. Just because he found it once doesn't mean that he was good at always finding it. So in 1857, he came back to Coloma and built a cabin. It is not the cabin we see here, because that cabin burned in 1862 when James Marshall's gold rush records were all lost. The cabin was rebuilt after the fire, and James Marshall lived with Doc Hutchins as roommate, and they grew grapes and turned the grapes into brandy and selling grapes, and worked with the Monroe family and a couple other local families in a really bright agricultural period in Coloma history. But eventually, Mr. James Marshall moved a little bit away from here, 6 miles, to a town called Kelsey, and he worked with George Fredric Parsons on a biography in 1870, and then went on a book tour in 1871 to promote the book. But James Marshall was not a good speaker. He rambled, and he didn't always show up, and he didn't speak loudly, and he had alcohol problems, and he eventually ran out of money. And Mr. Leland Stanford, the governor and eventual founder of Stanford University, sent him money to thank him for being such an important figure in the founding of California. And James Marshall used that money to visit his hometown in New Jersey. So age 61, he finally got to go see his sisters. And when he returned, he lived off of a pension and was rewarded $200 a month, and did some mining and blacksmith work. He still worked hard to do things with his skills, but relationships and his health were still challenges. And Mr. James Marshall passed away in 1885, still working hard, putting his skills to use. So we look at this and see that self-respect was a challenge for James. He had challenges with health, his own health. He had challenges managing his own money. He had challenges with alcohol. He had challenges in his relationships. But he was always able to use his own skills and his handiwork and his labor and his body to get by. But James Marshall was very good at respecting others. He always stood up for the rights of others, from his participation in the Bear Flag Rebellion and standing up for his fellow soldiers in the Mexican-American War, to standing up for the rights of Native Americans and the Chinese and the Irish when those people were being attacked by other people. He had no problem standing up and saying, "No, these people are doing the right thing, treat them fairly." So while James had challenges in his own life with his own self-respect, he had clear values for others. So we can reflect on this and see, how does this affect your life? How do you show respect for other people? How do you show respect for yourself? James Marshall is remembered with a monument and a cabin and a state park and all sorts of stories, all because of one day and one major event in his life. What will you be remembered for? Let us know.